If you're like us, you've probably seen references to something called Munchausen's by proxy and been curious, without really understanding what it is or how it may affect people. That's why we were excited to hear about the new podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me.
The host, novelist Andrea Dunlop, takes an in-depth look at this subject. No one has ever done this before. She talks with people who have been affected by this condition. She even speaks with a perpetrator.
We've already listened to the first 2 episodes, and we can tell you that Andrea doesn't dwell on the darkness. She takes great pains not to be gory or exploitative. This show has heart. It focuses on the humanity of everyone involved.
And what makes this podcast extra special is that Andrea has a deeply personal connection to this subject. Someone very close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy. That gives the show a real emotional punch. When Andrea is listening to people tell stories about how they've been affected by this condition, she is not some uninvolved outsider. She has lived through the very same pain they have. She understands them. And through this podcast, she helps all of us understand them too.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Content warning. This episode contains discussion of the brutal murder of 2 girls, as well as the topic of child sexual abuse materials. Listener discretion is advised.
The unsolved murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams have attracted a great deal of interest on the internet. There's a sprawling online community devoted to the case and to seeking justice for Libby and Abby. Much of the content they produce is informative and well-intentioned. Some of it isn't. But that community is one that we've become a part of just by doing journalism on this case.
The person we'll be speaking to in today's episode is also a part of this community. We previously released an episode in our ongoing mini-series, You Never Can Forget, about the Burger Chef murders, featuring a commenter we called Hank. That was a great opportunity to speak about a complex case with a knowledgeable researcher. And we thought we'd do something similar with this episode.
So we decided to reach out to Tony Garner. Tony is someone who's been following this case for quite a while. He's a tremendously talented researcher, and we respect his well-thought-out opinions and his grasp of this complicated case. We were thrilled when he agreed to sit down with us and talk through some of the latest developments.
We'll be discussing everything from Tony and Keegan Klein, the father and son duo whose sources tell us are the focus of the current Delphi investigation, to Nicole Robertson, the FBI agent who wrote up the probable cause affidavit for Ron Logan's property. My name is Anya Kane.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Anya and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We're the Murder Sheet.
And this is The Delphi Murders, a conversation with Tony Garner.
I wasn't like a web sleuth or an armchair detective. I didn't really follow a lot of true crime or anything like that. But what happened to Libby and Abby really grabbed me. I think if this crime just happened in the woods somewhere, And if Libby hadn't captured the images of her killer, it might not have captivated me so much. The images of the bridge seemed almost like mythological, crossing this bridge almost literally from life to death. The images of this man, and I've showed this pictures to friends of mine. They said, "Oh, it's a guy in a blue coat." But when I look at it, it's like a snapshot out of hell. It's like a photo of pure evil. And it seems like the longer this case goes on being unresolved, the more you're pulled in and the more you obsess about it and think about it. So back in the beginning, I didn't feel like there was much information in the media. I felt a lot of the statements from law enforcement were confusing and vague. So eventually I ended up where I think everyone else did, looking around social media platforms. And I got a lot more information there. It wasn't always great information. But I'll say this. So when Murder Sheet started covering the Delphi murders, I was just really drawn to the professionality, the great interviews, and that's when I reached out to you guys, and we began talking about Delphi.
And we're very, very glad you did reach out to us, Tony, because we really appreciate your insights. I think out of the many, many people we talked to about this case, you know this case perhaps the best. I feel like we can go to you with any detail, and you're going to be able to kind of put it together and come up with some really interesting insights. So we're really delighted that you joined us today, and we appreciate that. I guess, I think we can maybe kick it off perhaps by sort of having a discussion with one another about something that we recently published, which was the probable cause affidavit and search warrant for Ron Logan. This has gotten some attention recently, and it all kind of comes down to ultimately this report written by an FBI agent, Nicole Robertson. And there's obviously been a lot of discussion about Ron Logan himself, but I think one thing that we've spoken about is Nicole Robertson's involvement in this case and what that possibly speaks to. I guess, could we get your thoughts on that?
Yes. Nicole Robertson is an FBI agent that at the time was out of Chicago. So she's not from Indianapolis. She's not from Lafayette. Certainly not from Delphi. So Chicago's a little bit away. So why was she the agent writing this probable cause affidavit? It turns out that, to the best of my information, Nicole Robertson specialized in sex trafficking of minors. And if you think about the tips that had come in about Ron Logan and the information that law enforcement was acting upon, such as the false alibi, people saying that he resembled the man on the bridge, his proximity to the crime in his residence, that none of that you would think would bring in Nicole Robertson from Chicago to research this.
Yeah, very well said. I think that the inclusion of somebody who essentially seems like a specialist in a certain topic indicates that authorities at some point very early on in the investigation felt very strongly that the clues and the evidence was pointing in a specific direction.
Is that how you see it, Tony?
Yes, and I think that the reason that Nicole Robertson is on the case researching Ron Logan is because of what happened a month previous in the Klein raid. So the timeline's important here, in my opinion. They raid the Kleins, a week, 10 days after the murders? And they find all types of child solicitation and pornography on multiple devices. So to me, they're looking for a connection to that when they're going into search Ron Logan's property.
So that's really interesting. And I wonder, and of course we're speculating here, right? This is not, none of this conversation or this portion of the conversation is not based on what a source told us. It's all of us putting together the known facts and coming up with plausible explanations. One thing that stands out to me, though, is the possibility that Nicole Robertson, the FBI, the ISP, is possibly looking for a connection, actually, between Logan and the Kleins by dint of them looking for these items that speak to a possible ring of child predators, essentially.
Yes, I think that's totally the case. And more specifically, in the probable cause affidavit, there's a laundry list of computer and photographic type devices that they're looking for. And that stuff, again, makes more sense being somehow connected to what they found in Peru at the Klein residence than it necessarily would be from things they found at the scene of the crime and were linking to a 77-year-old man.
Right. What do you make of the fact that seemingly police have not or did not find anything when they did indeed raid Ron Logan's house in March of 2017? And I say that because he was never arrested. He was never charged with the crime. He was never even named as a person of interest or a suspect by police. So it feels like on some level, the outward indicators are that, Logan ended up not being linked to it. What are your thoughts, though?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think it says that he didn't do it. I think that it speaks strongly that he was suspicioned, or maybe they were suspicious that he was, again, in contact with someone who used his property to commit the crime. And they were trying to find some type of digital footprint, DNA, some traces of that person in that Logan property.
You've been looking into this case for longer than we have. And one thing that I wanted to get your take on is, a lot of people have said, well, Ron Logan looks like the person on the bridge. Do you think that there is an over-reliance on the sketches or the image of the man crossing the bridge when it comes to the public discourse around Delphi? Because it feels like people very much get hung up on those things pretty frequently, in my opinion, at least.
Well, people are going to vary widely about the images of the man on the bridge. People say it looks like a hat, and people say it looks like hair, and I did not get the hair. I've never understood why people thought it looked like that, but I think you get a lot of disagreement about it, and it's obviously not a clear image. As far as the sketches go, we don't even know why there are two sketches, and we've seen people feel like both of those sketches resemble all kinds of different looking and appearing people. So how much the sketch is actually helping at this point, I don't think it is.
To jump forward a bit, we released back in March the transcript of the police interrogation of Keegan Klein, and a number of people have pointed out that it seems pretty clear that Keegan is not entirely truthful in that interrogation, that he told a number of lies. Did you have any insights or thoughts about that?
Yes, I think that, Keegan Klein really implicates himself as having some knowledge of the crime because of the numerous lies that he tells. Someone who did not have anything to hide would have no reason to get caught up in all the confabulations that he does in that transcript.
What do you think his reason to lie might have been?
I think he's protecting someone. And he's protecting that person because he himself is possibly implicated.
It's very interesting. Another thing that's mentioned in that interrogation is they point out some of the things that Keegan had been doing research on online and Googling things. Was there anything about that caught your attention?
I think that some of the questions about how long does DNA last, looking for information about Abby and Libby, was clear that he was wanting to see what the media and law enforcement were saying about the crime. One point I would say that I believe the total number of times that he plays back the Down the Hill recording when it's first released is like 6 times. I don't think that's a big excessive number. I remember the first time I heard it, I couldn't understand what was being said. So I can see somebody playing it back 6 times just out of curiosity or trying to hear it better.
That could be a concerned citizen who's trying to commit the voice to memory to, see if they ever hear it again, that they'll be able to recognize it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree that some of the Keegan Klein's internet searches could have been somebody who was just interested in the case. Although that theory kind of gets blown out of the water a little bit, given that he's then in the same interview asserting, I had no idea about this. I had no interest in the case. He seemed to research it pretty extensively for somebody who claimed not to be super aware of it.
I would agree.
And that's the kind of weird thing about the Keegan Klein interview, is that he's kind of he's lying when he's obviously caught dead to rights. You feel like it would have been simpler to perhaps just say, yeah, I was interested in it, so was everybody. Or
because he knows that he talked to her the day of the murders, he could simply just say, I had talked to her that day, and I was really nervous about this.
Right. He strikes me as the kind of person who is lying a lot without necessarily being particularly good at it. A good liar tends to pick their battles. He seems like a person who is perhaps just not challenged a lot on his obvious lies in life, and then, kind of just went with that strategy going forward. So I was thinking Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
One thing I wanted to say about Ron Logan in his defense is that from what we know about this crime, a lot of planning went into it. In terms of the killer had what he needed to accomplish what he did. He evidently had knowledge of cleaning up the crime scene, and it's even stated in the probable cause affidavit that they were looking for information on electronic devices where the individual had searched for how to destroy a crime scene. So that's very meticulous. So if a guy is going to do this and not have a good alibi, that doesn't make any sense. And what Ron Logan comes up with for alibi is ridiculous and gets him into even more trouble. You would think if you were planning this crime to the extent that it was planned, you would have an alibi. A pretty good plan for one.
Yes, and that the call with his relative who drove him to the aquarium store in Lafayette, that call would be happening prior to the crime, almost, if it was going to be planned, and not the day of, when you're scrambling, essentially. It looks like more of a man panicking to me than somebody who is calculating enough to pull this off.
I agree.
What did you make about all the kind of confusion around, he's going to the dump earlier and then later on he's also driving, but he's only making the alibi for that and not the morning driving session?
My guess would be that he probably had some provisions that he could go to the doctor, to the transfer station, things like that. And that would that would not have been what was going to get him into trouble.
His initial alibi that afternoon didn't even include the time of the abduction, essentially, because from the video we can understand that they were abducted, say around a little after 10 past 2. Yeah, right. I think that I may have gotten that from you initially, Tony. I think, or I think maybe Kevin thought of that, and it really kind of made me think about the affidavit differently, because I was like, if you were going to give an alibi, why aren't you covering 2 p.m. at the very, latest? Instead, he's covering 3 p.m. onward. I think he later amended that to 2:30 p.m. But still, it's kind of like, you would think somebody who is really trying to conceal their role in the abduction would, just go for broke and perhaps say 1 p.m. onward or whatnot. But he didn't seem to be able to do that. And to me, that sloppiness kind of goes with what you're saying about why was his alibi so bad.
Correct.
I think for Kevin and I, at least, the Logan affidavit and search warrant were more interesting in what they tell us about what the investigators were looking for, because that gives us an idea of what the crime looked like, essentially. Because investigators, is a month after the murders, they're running this down, they're looking for specific things, and some of that was some of the technological devices that they're looking for. But another thing that I think stood out to all of us in this report is, things like forensic evidence. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or anything around the forensic evidence that they were looking for that really stood out to you.
Well, I think the clothing items that were missing speak to the depravity of the crime. That this was almost certainly a crime driven, at least in part, of sexual nature, or was an attempt to make it look like that was the motive of the crime.
There's also a reference in the affidavit to guns. What did you make of that?
I believe a gun was used in the crime in some way. Whether they found a ballistic, whether a gun was used as a blunt force instrument, I think it was used in some way other than just in an attempt to control them. Because what evidence would there be at the crime scene that would make you look for a gun, or a specific gun?
Yeah, it's like, if we could speculate for a second, if the man was audibly saying, "I have a gun," or the girls were talking about the gun in the recording that Libby took, that wouldn't identify anything. They wouldn't be able to look for anything specifically in their search. So it really does make you wonder about how that might have manifested itself, or what clues they were going off of, essentially.
Well, I guess, though, let's suppose that they do hear, they say the click of a revolver in the audio, or he says, I've got a gun. I guess it's possible that he would have got their blood on the gun, even if he didn't use it.
Right. So kind of maybe more of a forensic wrap up, as opposed to we have bullets, essentially.
Sure.
Over the years since this crime happened, there's really been a very vigorous online community that has developed around this case. And you've been a part of it. I just wondered if you had any comments or insights about that community.
Well, I believe that, some of the online communities are better than others. And I think that there is a lot of bogus information introduced in many of these communities, these Facebook groups and things like that. But I think there has been some legitimate research done in these groups as well.
I'm curious, what advice would you give to people listening as to how to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to the online community and the information they share?
I would start by taking notes, keeping track of the things you're seeing that seem to make sense, because you can very quickly accumulate folders on your computer that have all kinds of different things in it. Or you may feel the need to go back and look at something or reread something, and you just don't have it, or you can't find it. So I would say, to keep track of things that you find interesting, and I think you'll see which people are more genuine about their opinions and their research in these types of groups and on YouTube and social media. And then you'll see people that, obviously believe just about anything.
This case seems to have attracted the attention of people literally all over the world. What do you suppose it is about this case that has touched the hearts of so many?
I think I would just go back to what I said earlier about the archetypal quality of the story. It's almost like a Grimm Brothers fairy tale. And when I say archetypal, this is a term out of Jungian psychology, which refers to how certain motifs appear across different cultures, and there's similar stories, and it just sort of, the big stories stick, around for centuries. And this whole image of this crime, if you look at, two young women going out into the wilderness, crossing a bridge, this boogeyman, that confronts them, that imagery, it's not just here because it's in Indiana. It is worldwide. I was really surprised when Carter mentioned that he gets tips on a weekly basis from around the world.
You mentioned ISP Superintendent Doug Carter, and, obviously the three of us are working from the outside of this investigation. We're not law enforcement, so we're not privy to a lot of those decisions and whatnot that they're making. Kevin and I have been critical about some of the communication strategies that we feel that ISP in particular has employed around this case. We feel like it's kind of created an informational vacuum where speculation abounds. But I guess I would love to get your take, because you've been with this case for longer than we have. What's been your perception over time about how police are doing? And have any of the recent revelations about the Logan documents or the Klein documents, changed the way you think about it?
Well, I would totally agree that there is not enough information fluidly coming out of ISP about this case. There have been lots of questions about things that have been stated from law enforcement that are just not even clarified.
Yeah, I definitely don't understand that in particular, because it feels like that can really create uncertainty.
Why do you suppose they don't clarify those things?
I don't know why they don't clarify these things. I would think just a simple press secretary could do something like that. I understand that their philosophy is very rigid about keeping their cards close to the vest. But I think after such a great period of time, you have to consider changing strategy. And they've done that a little bit, but could more information be released? I'm a believer in that.
We are too, and I think after 5 years, I think it's reasonable for other entities in the media or whatnot to focus on police response to this crime. And, there needs to be perhaps some oversight of how they're doing. And I feel like a lot of their messaging almost tends to be like, we'll tell you all about this eventually. With a case that's 5 years old, I think it's reasonable to say, well, when is that coming exactly? Asking some of those tough questions about, like, is this on track to be solved? And if not, then what's happened?
I would agree.
So just backtracking a little bit, I want to go back to the Logan document. One thing that really stood out to us, Tony, was just the fact that it mentions cellular signals that were detected by law enforcement that seemingly, at least as of March 2017, they hadn't been able to track down. And I guess for you, what sort of picture does that paint of the crime?
The question I have is how many devices were in that area of the crime that they never were able to identify. In the Robert Ives interviews, he's talked about that they were unable to glean any data from the devices that were in that area. And it seems like he's saying multiple. And I think if there's one device, one phone, then that tells us something. And if there's 2 or 3 or 4, that also tells us something.
I have to add that I think that the fact that they haven't been able to track down those phones could tell us something, in that if somebody was employing a burner phone or burner phones in this crime, that to me speaks to a level of planning that I think is important to note, because that sort of changes how this looks to me. Like, it's not some sort of confrontation gone wrong. It's becoming much more like people or one person went there to do something specifically.
Yeah, I would interpret it that way.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you believe people have about this case?
There have been numerous syndicated shows talking about Ron Logan since Murder Sheet released the Ron Logan documents. And I think that many of these newscasters and journalists have maybe focused too much on Ron Logan, who aren't really familiar with the case and haven't really followed it. So I think that's one mistake that people are making. Another, I think the idea that the bodies were moved is a misconception in terms of moved any great distance. A lot of people have believed that they were moved because searchers had gone through that area on the 13th. And I just think there's a lot of reasons why the searchers might have missed them, on the 13th. It could have been that it was dark. It could have been they were looking for living girls. It could have been the gulchiness of the land hiding them. It would have been very difficult for someone to come back in the middle of the night and enter an area with a huge police presence and a massive search underway for these girls and to return their bodies.
I agree on both counts. Going back to the first, as a journalist, I think there can sometimes be an unconscious bias in the media to go for the easiest narrative. And when you have images of a very blurry person on the bridge that look somewhat, in fairness, like Ron Logan, I think there's a rush to say, well, that's the easy solution, as opposed to, ask harder questions, because you're dealing with time and space and a rush to get the news out. And I think then, that can prompt certain narratives to form when perhaps a more judicious approach is necessary to a case like this. And it seems important to point out that Ron Logan has not been tied to a social media account that was in contact with one of the victims right before her murder. That being the Anthony Schatz account, that being the Klein household, Keegan Klein and his father, Tony Klein. That's the house where that's coming out of. So we always try to stress that people should focus on the timeline and what was happening in 2020 versus what was happening in 2017. Things start to look a little bit more clear, and that the focus remains on the Kleins.
I would agree.
I'm curious, we talked about misconceptions that get too much attention. Are there details out there that you think don't get as much attention as they deserve to get, that people are just overlooking?
I think what we have now between the Logan's search documents and the transcripts with Keegan Klein, we see a common theme here that they were looking in 2017 for a connection to some type of pornography or child sex trafficking of some nature, and that being behind some aspect of this crime.
I'm curious, what do you think would be needed to bring this case to a resolution?
It seems that outside of a confession or a direct tip from someone who knows the killer, that the evidence is lacking at this point. Well, one idea would be that there could be advances in technology that would allow law enforcement to reanalyze the social media platforms that Abby and Libby were on in 2017. I find it very interesting that in 2017, they searched the home of Keegan Klein and find all this information, but it's not until 2021 where the discussion goes public about the Anthony Schatz account. It seems that there was some change in technology that allowed them to find this information.
Yeah, I think we're hopeful about something like that too, or, I think, but it also kind of, to circle back to something we were talking about earlier, it sort of really poses the question of why some of this information wasn't released earlier, because 5 years is a long time, especially if there's possible, people who are on some of these platforms interacting with Anthony Schatz. Might have been better for them to perhaps be alerted to the possibility that that account was a suspect earlier on, so they could, realize that and immediately go to police while this was fresh in their minds.
It's a great point. We don't really know when they actually found the connection between Anthony Schatz and Liberty German.
We wanted to thank Tony Garner for sharing his time and insights with us. We very much appreciate it.
And as always, if you have information on this case, email abbyandlibbytip at cacoshrf.com or call the tip line, which is 765-822-3535. And if you have information about the Kleins that you want to pass on to us, email murdersheet@gmail.com. We protect our sources. To our surprise, we've gotten a number of requests from people saying they would like a way to help financially support our efforts with the show. So, if you are interested, we are relaunching a Patreon page, which you can find at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. Join us there for 2 live video question and answer sessions each month. You can ask us anything, suggest new cases for us to look at, or even offer ideas for new leads for us to follow. If Patreon is not your thing, you can buy us a coffee at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. Thanks for the interest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Sheet, and on Facebook at MSheet Podcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.